A dangerous proposition. The twin moons of Crixus Prime cast their ethereal glow across the marketplace, their light filtering through the bioluminescent lamps that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The marketplace was usually alive with the sounds of commerce and conversation at this hour, but now an unnatural silence had fallen over the square. The cause of this silence stood at its center, King Theok of the Kxan Empire, his ornate armor catching and reflecting the mixed light of moons and lamps, creating an almost hypnotic effect. Beside him stood, or rather, lurched, his infamous companion, the Zion wolf Voreth. The beast's massive frame was clearly favoring 3 legs, with the 4th dragging behind it, leaving strange green streaks across the worn cobblestones. Its black fur rippled like liquid obsidian, and those fierce amber eyes darted from face to face in the crowd, as if daring anyone to make a sudden move. Jack Harper watched the scene unfold from his usual spot near the edge of the marketplace, where he'd been tinkering with a malfunctioning service droid. His tools lay forgotten in his lap as he observed the king's increasingly desperate demands for a healer. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. He could see it in the way the king's hand kept straying to his plasma sword, in the way the crowd kept inching backward, in the way the injured wolf's growls were getting progressively more pained and aggressive. Cowards! King Theok's voice boomed across the marketplace. Is this how you repay your king's protection? By hiding when his most valued companion needs aid? Jack found himself standing before he'd made the conscious decision to do so. His movement drew every eye in the marketplace, including those burning amber ones. The service droid at his feet gave a worried beep. "I'll do it," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly still air. "I'll help your wolf." The king's expression shifted from anger to confusion to something approaching amusement. "You? A human mechanic?" He gestured at Jack's oil-stained coveralls and the tool bag slung over his shoulder. "What do you know of healing?" Jack took a careful step forward, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "More than you might think, Your Majesty. The principles aren't that different. Whether you're dealing with a malfunctioning quantum drive or an injured limb, it's all about understanding systems and how they work together." A merchant near Jack muttered something that sounded like "death wish," but Jack kept his eyes focused on the king and his wolf. He'd spent the last 3 years on Crixus Prime, fixing everything from ancient mining equipment to sophisticated AI systems. In that time, he'd learned that confidence was often more important than credentials. "Besides," Jack continued, "it doesn't look like anyone else is volunteering." The king's eyes narrowed, but Jack could see the calculation happening behind them. Voreth let out another pained growl, and that seemed to make up the king's mind. "Very well, human. But know this, if Voreth dies under your care, you will wish you had never set foot on Crixus Prime." Jack nodded, already mentally cataloging what he knew about Zion wolf biology, which, admittedly, wasn't much. But he had other knowledge that might prove more valuable. During his time fixing the marketplace's various stalls and systems, he developed a friendship with Old Mai, an eccentric collector of information who ran the spice stall. Her database of alien species was extensive, if not entirely legal. "I'll need access to my workshop," Jack said, keeping his voice steady. "And I'll need to gather some supplies." The king's face darkened. "You expect me to let you take Voreth out of my sight?" "No, Your Majesty. I expect you to come with us. My workshop is just off the eastern edge of the marketplace. It's not far, and it has everything I might need." What Jack didn't mention was that his workshop also had a direct link to Old Mai's database hidden behind a false panel in his tool cabinet. He'd need that information if he was going to have any chance of helping Voreth without getting himself killed in the process. The king considered this for a moment, then nodded curtly. "Lead the way, mechanic. But remember, your life depends on your success." As Jack turned to lead them toward his workshop, he caught glimpses of the faces in the crowd. Some showed pity, others disbelief, and a few displayed something that might have been respect. But mostly, they looked at him the way people looked at the condemned, with a mixture of relief that it wasn't them and guilt for feeling that relief. The workshop was a converted shipping container, its walls lined with tools and spare parts from 100 different worlds. Diagnostic screens flickered to life as they entered, casting blue-white light across the cramped space. Jack had to quickly rearrange several pieces of equipment to clear enough space for Voritha's massive frame. "First things first," Jack said, pulling out his diagnostic scanner. "I need to understand what we're dealing with." "Your Majesty, when did you first notice the injury?" The king's expression suggested he wasn't used to being questioned, but he answered anyway. "During our hunt on the northern plains. We were pursuing a herd of crystal deer when Vorith suddenly faltered. I saw no obvious cause." Jack nodded, making mental notes as he carefully approached Vorith. The wolf's amber eyes tracked his movement, but something had changed in their gaze. The aggression had diminished slightly, replaced by what Jack hoped was curiosity. "May I?" he asked, holding up the scanner. Both the king and Vorith seemed to understand the question, and after a moment, the wolf settled onto its haunches, the injured leg stretched out before it. The scanner's readings were unlike anything Jack had seen before, but that wasn't surprising. Zion wolves were notoriously difficult to study, and their biology was a closely guarded secret of the Kxan Empire. But as Jack studied the data scrolling across his screen, certain patterns began to emerge. "Interesting," he muttered, almost forgetting his audience. "The tissue structure is similar to the crystalline matrix I've seen in some biomechanical systems. And these energy readings." "Speak plainly, mechanic," the king demanded. "What ails my wolf?" Jack looked up from his scanner, his mind racing. "Your Majesty, I believe Vorith has absorbed something during the hunt, something that's disrupting his natural biological systems." "The crystal deer you mentioned, they're silicon-based life forms, aren't they?" The king nodded slowly. "They are indeed. Their flesh is prized for its properties. And normally, Vorith can consume them without issue?" "Of course. He has hunted them many times before." Jack turned back to his scanner, a theory forming in his mind. "I think I know what's happened. But fixing it, that's going to be interesting." The king's hand moved to his plasma sword again. "Interesting. Challenging but not impossible," Jack quickly clarified. "I've seen something similar in quantum drives when their crystalline matrices get contaminated. The solution there is to introduce a calibrated electromagnetic pulse to realign the matrix. But with Vorith." He trailed off, his eyes moving to a particular cabinet in the corner of his workshop. Behind that false panel was Old Mai's database, which might contain the information he needed to adapt his mechanical knowledge to this biological problem. But he couldn't access it with the king watching. "I need to gather some specific equipment," Jack said carefully. "And I'll need to make some calculations. Would you allow me a few minutes to prepare?" The king's eyes narrowed again, but Vorith chose that moment to let out another pained sound, this one clearly more distressed than aggressive. The king's expression softened slightly as he looked at his companion. "You have 5 minutes, mechanic. Use them wisely." Jack nodded and moved to his storage areas, making a show of gathering various pieces of equipment while his mind raced. He needed a distraction, something that would give him just enough time to access the database without arousing suspicion. The answer came in the form of the service droid he'd been repairing earlier, which had followed them to the workshop. With a subtle movement, Jack activated its diagnostic sequence, a process he knew would produce a shower of harmless but impressive-looking sparks in exactly 3 minutes. Now he just had to hope he could find what he needed in Old Mai's database before time ran out. The life of a rather interesting wolf, and his own, depended on it. Hidden knowledge. The service droid sparks erupted right on schedule, drawing the king's attention just long enough for Jack to slip the data chip from Old Mai's database into his diagnostic scanner. His fingers flew across the holographic interface, searching for any information about Zion wolf biology. What he found made his blood run cold. According to the database, Zion wolves weren't just biological entities, they were semi-synthetic creatures, created through a complex fusion of genetic engineering and crystalline technology. The KXAN Empire's most closely guarded secret wasn't just the wolves' biology, but their very origin. Mechanic. The king's voice snapped Jack back to the present. What progress? Jack quickly pocketed the scanner, his mind racing to process what he'd learned. I think I understand the problem better now, Your Majesty. Voritha's injury isn't just physical, it's affecting the crystalline structures in his body. The king's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of concern crossing his face. Continue. The crystal deer's silicon-based flesh has created a resonance disruption in Voritha's system. It's like, imagine two quantum crystals vibrating at different frequencies. When they clash, it can cause a cascade failure. Jack moved to his workbench, pulling out various pieces of equipment. I can help, but I'll need to calibrate an electromagnetic pulse very precisely. Vorith growled softly, but the sound was different now, almost questioning. The wolf's amber eyes tracked Jack's movements with an intelligence that seemed far beyond that of a normal predator. Now that Jack knew what to look for, he could see the subtle shimmer of crystalline structures beneath the wolf's obsidian fur. What you're suggesting, the king said slowly, sounds dangerously close to classified KXAN technology. Jack kept his voice steady as he assembled his makeshift treatment device. I've worked with similar principles in quantum drives. The physics is the same, even if the application is different. He silently thanked his years of experience in talking his way through delicate situations with suspicious clients. The king's hand remained near his plasma sword, but he nodded. Proceed. But know that if you speak of this to anyone. I understand, Your Majesty. Professional discretion is part of my service. As Jack worked, he couldn't help but notice how Voritha's attention seemed increasingly focused on him. The wolf's initial aggression had given way to something else, curiosity, perhaps, or recognition. According to Old Mai's database, Zion wolves possessed a form of crystalline neural network that gave them extraordinary intelligence and perception. Jack carefully attached sensor nodes around Voritha's injured leg, monitoring the readings on his scanner. The crystalline disruption was worse than he'd initially thought, it was spreading through the wolf's system like a virus through a computer network. This might feel strange, Jack warned, making eye contact with Vorith. But it shouldn't hurt. Try to stay still. To his surprise, Vorith actually settled more firmly onto the workshop floor, as if understanding his instructions. The king watched with barely concealed tension as Jack activated the electromagnetic pulse generator. The effect was immediate and stunning. Voritha's fur rippled with waves of bioluminescence, patterns of light flowing through his body like circuits on a motherboard. The wolf's amber eyes flared brighter, and for a moment, Jack could have sworn he saw complex equations and diagrams floating in their depths. But something wasn't right. The readings on Jack's scanner showed the disruption was being contained, but not eliminated. There was another layer to the problem, something the database hadn't covered. Your Majesty, Jack said carefully, when exactly did you acquire Vorith? The king's expression darkened. That is not relevant to his treatment. I think it might be. These readings suggest there's something unique about his crystalline matrix, something that's affecting how he processes the silicon contamination. Before the king could respond, a loud alarm blared from the marketplace. Both men turned toward the sound, and in that moment, Voritha's eyes locked with Jack's. A strange sensation flooded his mind, images, sensations, and information flowing like data through a quantum network. Jack gasped as understanding hit him. Vorith wasn't just any Zion wolf, he was a prototype, one of the first successful fusions of biological and crystalline technology. And he was trying to communicate. The alarm continued to wail, and now they could hear shouts and the sound of running feet from the marketplace. The king moved to the workshop's entrance, his attention divided between the commotion outside and his injured companion. Stay here, he commanded. Continue the treatment. I must see what's happening. As soon as the king left, Voritha's demeanor changed completely. The wolf rose to his feet, favoring his injured leg but moving with clear purpose. He approached Jack's workbench and, with deliberate precision, used his snout to push aside a panel of tools, revealing a hidden compartment Jack hadn't known existed. Inside was a small crystalline device, similar in structure to the components Jack had seen in quantum drives, but far more sophisticated. As he reached for it, Voritha's thoughts flooded his mind again, this time clearer and more focused. The wolf wasn't just injured, he was transforming. The silicon contamination hadn't been an accident, it was a catalyst, triggering changes that had been programmed into his crystalline matrix from the beginning. Changes that the KXAN Empire had never intended to activate. Jack looked at the device, then at Vorith, understanding dawning. You led him here on purpose, he whispered. You chose me because you knew I'd understand the technology. Voritha's response was a complex burst of information that left Jack reeling. The wolf was part of something much bigger than a king's hunting companion. He was a key to understanding the true nature of the KXAN Empire's power, and possibly changing it forever. The sound of boots on metal told them the king was returning. Jack quickly pocketed the crystalline device and resumed his position by the treatment apparatus. As Theik entered, he was already speaking. There are reports of unauthorized ships entering the system. Trackers of some kind, though their configuration is unknown. The king's eyes narrowed as he looked between Jack and Vorith. You will complete your work quickly, mechanic. We must return to the palace. Jack nodded, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd learned. Of course, your majesty. But the treatment is delicate. Rushing it could cause permanent damage to Voritha's systems. The king's face hardened, but before he could respond, another alarm joined the first, this one deeper and more urgent. Through the workshop's small window, Jack could see the twin moons of Crixus Prime reflected in the suddenly active defense shields that shimmered into existence above the marketplace. Something was coming. Something that had been waiting for this exact moment, when a king's treasured wolf would be in the care of a mechanic who could understand its true nature. Jack looked at his scanner, at the complex patterns of crystalline disruption that he now recognized as something very different from an injury. He had a choice to make, and very little time to make it. The device in his pocket seemed to pulse with potential, while outside, the signs of approaching chaos grew stronger. The king's hand tightened on his plasma sword. Mechanic, you will finish now. Yes, your majesty, Jack said, making adjustments to his equipment. I'm nearly done. Just one final calibration. As he worked, Jack's mind raced through possibilities. Whatever was coming, whatever Vorith was becoming, whatever role he was meant to play in all of this, the next few minutes would change everything. He just hoped he could keep them all alive long enough to see what that change would bring. The awakening. The crystalline device in Jack's pocket pulsed with increasing urgency as the defense shields above Crixus Prime's marketplace rippled with electromagnetic disturbances. Through his workshop's viewport, he could see streams of civilians evacuating the area, their movements casting strange shadows in the combined light of the twin moons and the shimmering shields. Your Majesty, Jack said, making a show of adjusting his equipment, I need to stabilize these readings before. A massive explosion rocked the marketplace, sending tools clattering from Jack's workbench. The king steadied himself against the wall, his ornate armor catching the light of emergency beacons that had begun flashing outside. No more delays, Theik commanded, drawing his plasma sword. The weapon hummed to life, casting an eerie purple glow across the workshop. Complete your work or... The king's threat was cut short by another explosion, closer this time. Through the chaos, Jack heard something that made his blood run cold, the distinctive howls of more Zion wolves, approaching from multiple directions. Voritha's response was immediate and unexpected. The massive wolf rose to his full height, his injured leg seemingly forgotten, and positioned himself between Jack and the king. The wolf's fur rippled with patterns of light that Jack now recognized as data streams, complex information flowing through his crystalline matrix. "Vorith," the king said, his voice dangerous and low, "stand down." But the wolf didn't move. Instead, the patterns in his fur intensified, and Jack felt another burst of information flood his mind. This time, the images were clearer: vast laboratories hidden beneath KXAN palace spires, rows of crystalline incubation chambers, and something else, something that made Jack's eyes widen in disbelief. "They're not just weapons," Jack whispered, the truth finally clicking into place. "They're a network. A living, growing quantum network." The king's expression shifted from anger to cold calculation. "You understand nothing, mechanic." "I understand enough," Jack replied, his hand closing around the crystalline device in his pocket. "The Zion wolves aren't just hunting companions or status symbols. They're nodes in a vast biological quantum computer. That's why the KXAN Empire has maintained its technological superiority for so long. You've been using their combined processing power." A bitter smile crossed Theik's face. "Very good, human. But incomplete. The wolves are more than processors, they're the key to our evolution. Each one contains a fragment of the original crystalline matrix, growing, learning, waiting for the right moment to." The workshop door burst open, cutting off the king's words. In the doorway stood old Mai, the spice merchant, but not as Jack had ever seen her before. Gone was the hunched posture and weathered merchant's robes, replaced by the straight-backed bearing of a military commander and the sleek combat suit of the resistance. "Step away from the wolf, your majesty," Mai said, her voice carrying none of its usual quaver. "The evacuation of the marketplace is complete. We have control of the sector." The king's laugh was sharp and cold. "You think you can challenge the KXAN Empire with a handful of rebels and stolen ships?" "Not just rebels," Mai replied, as more figures appeared behind her. To Jack's astonishment, they were all wearing uniforms he recognized from old Mai's database, the insignia of the Coalition of Free Worlds, a legendary organization thought to have been destroyed in the last Great War. But what truly caught Jack's attention was the device Mai held, a larger version of the crystalline shard in his pocket, pulsing with the same rhythmic energy. "The awakening cannot be stopped," Mai said, her eyes moving to Vorith. "The network is already active. Every Zion wolf in the Empire is receiving the signal." As if in response to her words, Voritha's fur erupted in a dazzling display of bioluminescence. The patterns were different now, not just data streams, but something more complex, more alive. Jack's diagnostic scanner went wild, recording energy signatures unlike anything he'd ever seen. The king raised his plasma sword, but Vorith moved faster than seemed possible. With a surge of crystalline-enhanced muscle, the wolf knocked the weapon away, sending it skittering across the workshop floor. In the same motion, he pinned Theik against the wall, not with violence, but with an almost gentle precision. "The wolves were never meant to be weapons," Mai explained, moving into the workshop. "They were meant to be bridges, living links between organic and synthetic life. The KXAN Empire corrupted their purpose, used them to build their power, but they couldn't erase their true nature forever." Jack pulled the crystalline device from his pocket, watching as it resonated with the larger one Mai held. "That's what the silicon contamination was about, wasn't it? It wasn't an accident during the hunt, it was a trigger." Mai nodded. "A carefully planned trigger, decades in the making. The crystal deer were engineered specifically for this purpose. When Vorith consumed their flesh, it began a transformation that the Empire's founders never anticipated, but that we've been working toward for generations." The king struggled against Voritha's hold, his face twisted with rage. "You have no idea what you're doing. The wolves are the product of KXAN science, our greatest achievement." "They're not your achievement at all," Mai cut him off. "They're the legacy of something far older than the KXAN Empire. Something that's finally ready to wake up." As if responding to her words, the crystalline devices began to pulse in unison. Through the workshop viewport, Jack could see more Zion wolves approaching, their fur rippling with the same complex patterns as Voritha's. But they weren't attacking, they were forming a circle around the building, their crystalline matrices linking together in what Jack realized was the most sophisticated quantum network ever created. The scanner in Jack's hand displayed readings that defied conventional physics. The wolves weren't just communicating, they were transforming the very fabric of reality around them, using principles that made quantum mechanics look primitive. What happens now? Jack asked, looking between Vorith, and the imprisoned king. Mai's smile was both sad and hopeful. Now, mechanic, you get to help us repair something that was broken long ago. The wolves aren't just going to transform, they're going to transform everything around them. Including us. Outside, the twin moons of Crixus Prime cast their light through the marketplace's defense shields, creating patterns that seemed to mirror the ones flowing through Voritha's fur. The crystalline network was spreading, growing, awakening something that had been sleeping in the shadows of the galaxy for millennia. And at the center of it all stood a human mechanic who had simply wanted to help an injured wolf, unknowingly stepping into a moment that would reshape the future of not just the KXAN Empire, but all of known space. The real question was, what would that future look like when the transformation was complete? Transformation. The workshop's metal walls groaned under the pressure of the energy field emanating from the gathered Zion wolves. Jack's diagnostic equipment was reporting impossible readings, quantum fluctuations that shouldn't exist in normal spacetime, energy patterns that defied known physics, and something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, consciousness. Not just the individual consciousness of each wolf, but a vast, growing, collective awareness that was spreading through their crystalline network. We need to move, Mai announced, her eyes on a holographic display projecting from her wrist unit. KXAN reinforcements will be here soon, and we need to be at the nexus point when the transformation reaches critical mass. Nexus point? Jack asked, gathering his most essential tools. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd need them, even in the midst of whatever metaphysical event was unfolding. The ancient ruins beneath the marketplace, Mai explained, as Vorith continued to hold King Theik immobile. The KXAN Empire built here for a reason, though they never fully understood why. The crystalline technology they used to create the Zion wolves. They didn't invent it. They found it, buried in those ruins. The king laughed, a harsh sound despite his compromised position. You speak of children's tales. The technology is ours. The technology, Mai cut him off, is older than your empire, older than any human civilization. And it's finally waking up. As if to emphasize her point, the crystalline device she held pulsed with increasing intensity. Through the workshop viewport, Jack could see more Zion wolves arriving, their fur rippling with patterns that seemed to bend the light around them. The twin moons of Crixus Prime appeared to shimmer and dance in response, their light taking on new qualities that Jack's eyes struggled to process. Jack, Mai said, her voice urgent but kind, you need to make a choice. What's coming, not everyone will be able to adapt to it. The crystalline network is going to rewrite the basic rules of reality in this sector of space. Those without the right preparation, the right understanding. She didn't need to finish the thought. Jack could see it in the way reality was already starting to bend around the edges, in the way his diagnostic equipment was reporting increasingly bizarre readings. This wasn't just a political revolution or a technological breakthrough, it was an evolutionary event. What do you need me to do? He asked, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. Mai smiled. What you do best, fix things. The ruins contain the original crystalline matrix, but thousands of years of decay and interference have corrupted key elements. We need your understanding of both mechanical and crystalline systems to help stabilize the transformation. A violent tremor shook the workshop, sending tools clattering to the floor. Through the viewport, Jack could see the marketplace's defensive shields beginning to fail, not from any external attack, but from the sheer weight of the reality-warping field being generated by the gathered wolves. And if I can't? Jack asked, watching as patterns of light similar to those in Voritha's fur began to spread across the workshop's walls. Then the transformation will be incomplete, Mai said grimly. Instead of a controlled evolution, we'll have chaos. The crystalline network will still remake reality, but without guidance, without purpose. The results would be unpredictable. Another tremor, stronger this time. King Theic's armor began to shimmer and shift, the starlight-like material responding to the changing quantum field. The king himself seemed to be struggling with more than just Voritha's restraint. His eyes were wide, darting around as if seeing things no one else could. The gift was never meant for you, the king whispered, but his voice had changed, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the crystalline network. You should have left it sleeping. The gift wasn't meant for any one species, Mai countered. It was meant to be a bridge, a way for life itself to evolve beyond the limitations of organic or synthetic existence. The KXAN Empire just happened to stumble upon it first. Jack's pocket buzzed, the small crystalline shard he'd taken from Voritha's hidden compartment was growing warm, its pulse synchronizing with the larger device Mai held. As he pulled it out, he saw that it had changed, becoming more complex, more alive. Voritha's eyes met his, and another burst of information flooded his mind. But this time, it wasn't just data or images. It was understanding. The wolf wasn't just showing him something, he was teaching him, preparing him for what needed to be done. We need to go, Mai urged. The ruins. She was cut off by a new sound, the deep, resonant boom of KXAN warships entering the atmosphere. The Empire wasn't about to let go of its power without a fight. They'll try to stop the transformation, Mai said, moving toward the workshop's rear exit. They don't understand that it's already too late. The question now is whether we can guide it. Jack looked at his diagnostic scanner, at the tools of his trade, at the crystalline shard pulsing in his hand. Then he looked at Vorith, seeing past the wolf's physical form to the complex quantum architecture beneath. Everything he'd learned about mechanical systems, about quantum drives, about the intersection of organic and synthetic life, it had all been preparing him for this moment. The ruins, he said, his mind racing with new understanding. They're not just ruins, are they? They're parts of a machine. A living machine. Mai's smile was bright with approval. The biggest machine ever built. A quantum computer the size of a planet, designed to guide the evolution of entire species. And you, Jack Harper, might be the only person alive who can help us fix it. Another tremor shook the workshop, and this time, Jack could see the metal walls beginning to crystallize, transforming at the molecular level. The process that had started with Vorith was spreading, changing everything it touched. Above them, the KXAN warships opened fire, their energy weapons cutting through the failing defensive shields. But where their beams struck the transformed areas of the marketplace, strange things began to happen. The energy was absorbed, redirected, transformed by the crystalline network into something else entirely. Time to go, Mai announced, as Vorith finally released the king, who slumped to the floor, his armor now more crystal than metal. The next few hours will determine whether this transformation leads to a new age of evolution or the collapse of reality itself. As they hurried from the workshop, Jack clutched his tools and the crystalline shard, his mind racing with calculations and possibilities. He was no longer just a mechanic faced with an unusual repair job. He was about to attempt to fix the most complex machine in known space, while reality itself transformed around him. The twin moons of Crixus Prime watched from above, their light seeming to pulse in time with the crystalline network that was spreading across the planet's surface. The future of not just the KXAN Empire, but of all sapient life, would depend on what happened next in the ruins beneath an alien marketplace. And somehow, Jack knew, that future would be determined not just by technology or biology, but by the choices made by a human mechanic, a resistance leader, and a quantum wolf who had chosen to trust them with the greatest secret in the galaxy. Evolution. The ancient ruins beneath Crixus Prime's marketplace were nothing like Jack had imagined. Instead of crumbling stone or corroded metal, he found himself in a vast chamber that seemed to be alive with crystalline energy. The walls pulsed with the same patterns he'd seen in Voritha's fur, but on a massive scale, creating a three-dimensional lattice of light and information that stretched far beyond what his eyes could comprehend. The heart of the machine, Mai breathed, her combat suit now partially crystallized, adapting to the intense quantum field that filled the chamber. The origin point of all KXAN crystalline technology. Above them, they could hear the muffled sounds of battle as the Empire's forces engaged with the transformed sections of the marketplace. The crystalline network was spreading faster now, changing not just physical matter but the underlying fabric of spacetime itself. Vorith padded forward, his massive form moving with fluid grace despite the chaotic energies swirling around them. The wolf's fur had become almost translucent, revealing the complex crystalline structures beneath that were now fully active, fully awakened. "This is why you chose me," Jack said, understanding finally dawning. "Not just because I could help with your injury, but because you knew I'd understand this." He gestured at the living machine that surrounded them. "It's all connected, mechanical systems, biological systems, quantum systems. They're all just different expressions of the same underlying principles." The wolf's response was a surge of information so complex that Jack stumbled, overwhelmed by the flood of knowledge. Mai steadied him, her eyes concerned but determined. "The original builders," she explained, "created this facility as more than just a machine. It's a transformation engine, designed to guide the evolution of consciousness itself. But it needs someone who understands both the mechanical and the organic, someone who can bridge the gap between what is and what could be." Jack pulled out his diagnostic scanner, modified now by the crystalline energies that permeated everything around them. The readings it displayed were beyond anything he'd seen before, but somehow, he could understand them. The patterns were familiar, like the flow of energy through a quantum drive, like the circulation of blood through living tissue, like the dance of electrons through neural networks. "The KXAN Empire found this place," he said, pieces clicking into place, but they only understood part of it. They used the crystalline technology to create the Zion wolves, but they didn't realize. They didn't realize they were creating the keys to their own transformation, Mai finished. The wolves were never meant to be weapons or tools. They were meant to be catalysts. A violent tremor shook the chamber, and Jack's scanner screamed warnings. The transformation was accelerating, spreading beyond their control. Above them, the sounds of battle had changed, becoming stranger, more abstract. Reality itself was beginning to fray at the edges. "If we don't stabilize it," Mai warned, "the transformation will become chaotic. Instead of guided evolution, we'll have random mutation. The entire sector could collapse into quantum uncertainty." Jack looked at his scanner, at the tools in his bag, at the crystalline shard that pulsed in harmony with the chamber's energies. Then he looked at Vorith, seeing not just a wolf, not just a quantum computer, but a bridge between worlds. "I need to interface directly with the system," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Not just through tools or scanners. If this is really about bridging gaps, about understanding different types of systems." Mai's eyes widened. "Jack, the amount of data, the complexity of the fields, it could overwhelm your consciousness completely. Not if I have help." He turned to Vorith. "That's what you've been preparing me for, isn't it? All those bursts of information, teaching me to process quantum data through direct neural interface." The wolf's amber eyes seemed to glow with approval. Around them, the crystalline lattice of the chamber pulsed in sync with Voritha's biorhythms. "The KXAN ships are breaching the marketplace's defenses," Mai reported, checking her wrist display. "We don't have much time." Jack took a deep breath, then stepped forward into the heart of the chamber. The crystalline shard in his hand had grown warm, its structure changing, adapting. He held it up, watching as tendrils of energy connected it to the larger matrix around them. "I'm going to need some tools I never thought I'd use," he said, pulling equipment from his bag. With quick, precise movements, he began modifying his diagnostic scanner, integrating it with the crystalline technology. And Vorith? I'm going to need you to be my translator. The data streams are too complex for my human brain to process directly. The wolf moved to his side, fur shimmering with increasingly complex patterns. Mai took up a defensive position near the chamber's entrance, her weapon ready but her expression suggesting she wasn't sure what she'd be defending against as reality continued to transform around them. Jack's modified scanner interfaced with the crystalline shard, creating a feedback loop of energy and information. The chamber's walls seemed to pulse in response, the patterns of light becoming more ordered, more purposeful. "Here goes everything," Jack muttered, and pressed the final sequence on his scanner. The world exploded into light and information. Jack felt his consciousness expand, connected suddenly to not just Vorith's quantum mind but to the entire crystalline network that was spreading across Crixus Prime. He saw everything, the KXAN ships in orbit, their weapons fire being absorbed and transformed by the crystalline fields, the marketplace above, where reality was rewriting itself according to new rules of physics, the surprised faces of Empire soldiers as their own armor began to crystallize and change. But more than that, he saw the truth about the transformation. It wasn't just about changing matter or energy or consciousness. It was about evolution itself evolving, about life finding new ways to grow and adapt and become more than the sum of its parts. Through his connection with Vorith, Jack began to understand how to guide the process. His experience with mechanical systems gave him insight into the structured patterns needed for stability. His human intuition helped him shape the transformation in ways that organic life could survive and thrive within. And Vorith's quantum consciousness helped him process and implement the changes on a scale that would have been impossible alone. The chamber's energies responded to their combined will. The chaotic elements of the transformation began to stabilize, forming new patterns that were neither purely organic nor purely mechanical, but something entirely new. "It's working," Mai called out, her voice distant through the flood of quantum data. "The crystalline network is stabilizing. The transformation it's becoming coherent." Jack could feel it. Through his connection to the network, he could sense the changes rippling out across Crixus Prime. The KXAN ships in orbit weren't being destroyed, they were being incorporated into the transformation, their crews included. The Empire's power wasn't being broken, but transformed into something new, something that could no longer be hoarded or controlled by any one group. The twin moons of Crixus Prime shone down through layers of transformed reality, their light creating interference patterns in the crystalline fields that had once been normal space. And in those patterns, Jack could see the future taking shape, a future where the boundaries between organic and mechanical, between conscious and unconscious, between individual and collective, would never be quite the same. Hours later, as the transformation stabilized and the new reality began to settle into place, Jack stood in what had once been his workshop. The walls were now living crystal, humming with quantum information. Through the viewport, he could see the transformed marketplace, where humans and aliens alike were beginning to explore their new existence, their bodies and minds partially crystallized but still fundamentally themselves. Vorith sat beside him, no longer just a wolf but a living interface between multiple states of being. Mai stood at the door, her combat suit now fully integrated with her body in ways that blurred the line between technology and biology. "What happens now?" Jack asked, watching as the twin moons cast their light through the crystalline structures that had once been buildings. "Now." Mai smiled. "Now we learn how to live in a universe where evolution isn't just a biological process anymore. Where consciousness can flow between organic and mechanical forms freely. Where every repair job might involve quantum physics, and every wolf might be a doorway to another state of being." Jack looked down at his tools, at the diagnostic scanner that was now partially crystallized, at his own hands that shimmered faintly with quantum energy. He was still a mechanic, but the definition of what needed fixing, and how to fix it, had changed forever. "Well," he said, a smile tugging at his lips, "I always did enjoy a challenge." Vorith's answering growl carried harmonics that resonated through multiple layers of reality, and Jack knew that whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. The universe had changed, evolution had evolved, and somewhere in the vast crystalline network that now connected everything, new adventures were waiting to begin. The transformation was complete, but the real work of understanding and shaping this new reality was just beginning. And somehow, that felt exactly right to a mechanic who had once just wanted to help an injured wolf, and had ended up helping to fix the fabric of reality itself.